Hello guys, my name is Remik and welcome to this beginner-friendly course about .NET 9 authentication using JSON Web Tokens and Refresh Tokens. We're gonna cover the step-by-step process starting from the setting up the identity in your project. Then we're gonna extend the existing identity user with some new, very useful for us properties. Then I'm gonna show you how to configure properly the DB context and the entity framework core, and then how to create the logic to generate the JWT tokens and refresh tokens and the three main endpoints, so to register the user, to log in, and to refresh an already expired JWT token. If you haven't subscribed my channel yet, then I highly recommend to click onto the subscribe button down below to support me on the Patreon. The link is down below in the description, to give me the like, to write the comment, and now let's get started. Alright guys, at first let's see what we'll achieve after completing this course, and then we're gonna go into the details of the implementation, how to actually build that kind of the API. So as you see on the screen, I have already up and running API with the Scalar interface. So in .NET 9 we are not able to use the Swagger anymore, so we'll set up the Scalar, and we have a couple of the endpoints. The first one is called movies, to get the list of the simple movies, so the list of the strings from the API. And when we'll just execute the sample request, then we'll see that we have the 401 unauthorized error. So it means that our user was not authenticated based on a JWT, so it will receive 401 in this case. So I'll create now the user. So I'll create the test request. So at first it will be the email. So the first name, the last name, and also the password. All right, now I'm gonna send the request, and we see that we have 200 OK response. So now I will take this data and I will pass it into the login endpoint. So now when I will close this up and I will try to log in as this recently created user, and when I will send the request to our API, we see that in the cookies inside of the browser, we received two of the cookies. So access token and refresh token. So as we see inside of it as well, that the cookie is the HTTP only, with the flag HTTP only equals to true for both of these. So it's the more secure way rather than returning the plain text access tokens or the refresh tokens in the body of the response. So now when I will try to access the movies, as you see, we have the list of the movies and it will be the only one, so the matrix. And now when I will try the refresh token endpoint, we don't need to pass anything. We'll just take what we have already in the cookies, so the access token and the refresh token. So then in this case, when we'll pass the access token that already has an expiration date that will be not valid anymore, we'll receive as the response the brand new access token with the refresh token as well. So when I will send it, we're gonna see that it actually changed. So now we see that we have the brand new access token and also the refresh token. Now let's talk about JSON Web Token and what's inside of it. So I'm just gonna copy the value out of this access token. So in fact, the JWT cookie And in the website called JSON Web Tokens, JWT.io, we are able to paste this token and to decode it to check what's inside of it. So I'm just gonna paste what it was generated for us by the API that we built. And now the JSON Web Token, as you see, is the compact self-contained method for securely transmitting the information between the parties as the JSON object. So it consists of the three parts. The first one is called header, that it has the token type and the hashing algorithm that was used. The main part of the JWT token is called payload. Inside of the payload, it contains the claims or the statements about the user and additional data. So it can include the standard fields like the sub, so the subject, issuer, what was the issuer for that token, the expiration time, and so on and so forth. But we can also add other claims that can be useful, for instance, in our client. So like the first name, last name, and email that was generated in our API. And the signature that ensures the integrity of the token. So it's created by combining both of the parts, so the header and the payload. Then also it applies the secret key that should be stored in a very secure place, such as the Azure Key Vault, and then applying the specified algorithm. Now, the very important topic to think about is just to keep in mind that the JSON Web Tokens, once it will be possessed, it can be used for the authentication by, for instance, some attackers. So you have to know that the JSON Web Token has to be as short as possible in terms of the expiration time. So in this tutorial, we'll keep the 15 minutes of the JSON Web Token. Once it will be reached, then it will not be valid anymore. And when it will be expired, then of course the client can use our endpoint for refreshing the token. So it will be taken from the cookie and it will be checked if actually this refresh token is the same as this one that was processed in the cookie. If it will be valid and the expiration time of this token, of course, that will store as well in database will be valid for now, then we'll generate another JSON Web Token and the new refresh token will be returned as the cookie, and as well it will be saved in the database. Enough talking, let's start finally coding. So as you see on the screen, I have brandly new created .NET 9 Web API with the default setup, and now I will create 3 layers to keep our project in the good structured way. So I'm just gonna create new project, and it will be the class library, and I will call it authentication.domain. I will remove the sample class. The next one will be the application layer. So authentication.application as the class library. And the last one will be called authentication.infrastructure. I will remove those sample classes. And now I'll create the directory called entities, and we'll have the one entity here that will be called user. And we need to extend the identity user that will come from the identity that we'll set up in this project with some more properties, and it will be the first name, last name, refresh token, and the expiration date for this refresh token. We need to install one Nugget package that will be called Microsoft ASP Net Core Identity Entity Framework Core. And once we'll install it, we'll be able to inherit from the identity user. And now I will just inherit from the identity user, and we'll pass the type for the primary key, and it will be the GUID in this case. Now I will add 4 more properties to extend this identity user. So I will just type public string that will be required first name. I will duplicate it and I will change the first to the last name. The next one will be the public nullable string that will be called refresh token. And the last one will be public datetime nullable refresh token expires at UTC. Now I'll paste the method in here that we'll use to create the user object based on the 3 parameters, so the email, first name, and the last name. In this case, we need to pass the username because the identity API requires us to do so. So we'll use the email for the username and for the email as well. And also the last method that we'll have in this class will be just the toString method to generate the first name and the last name that will be for us beneficial when we'll create the JWT token, and it will be one of our claims in the JWT token. Now I will create another directory that will be called requests, and of course we need 2 of them. So the login request.cs, and it will be the type of the record. And inside of it, we'll need the public required string email, and the last one will be required password. And the last request that we'll need is the register request. And the structure will look very similar, but we'll need the email, first name, last name, and the password. So I can basically copy those 2 values, and it will be the public required string first name, and it will be the last name as well. Now I will set up the Entity Framework core in our project. So in the infrastructure layer, so the place where our DB context will be located, I need to install 3 Nugget packages, and the first one will be called Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core. So I will install this one. The next one will be called Abstractions from Entity Framework Core. And now the last one will be the nugget associated with the database provider. I will be using in this tutorial the PostgreSQL database, so I will install this nugget over there. Now I will create the new class that will be called application DB context, and we'll inherit from the identity DB context, and we need to pass what kind of entity will be responsible for us as the user object that we have extended in the domain layer. So the user extends the identity user. So we'll be using this user over there. We have to, of course, reference the domain layer. And then we need to pass the identity role with, of course, the type of the primary key. So since we are using in the user class the GUID as the identifier, we need to pass as well this GUID over there. And after that, after the comma, we need to, of course, use the GUID as well to make it properly configured in here. Now I'll create the constructor and we need to pass the DB context options with the type of the application DB context. We'll call it options, and those options we need to pass, in here to the base constructor. And now, of course, we have to set up the DB set of the users that we have created. So it will extend the existing ASP.NET users table that comes from the identity, but it will have inside of it those 4 customly created by us properties. So we'll add those 4 columns to the ASP.NET users table. And now I will need to override the onModel method to set up the first name and the last name, the max length of those properties. So I'll just type protected override onModel. We'll use this base as the first line. And now builder entity user, the property of it, user first name has maximum length of 256 characters, and the same will be done for the last name. Now, since we have created the application DB context that inherits from the identity DB context with the specific custom type and the GUID as the type of the primary key, we are ready to create the specific section in the upsetting.json file to point to the database that we'll be using, so the PostgreSQL database. So I'll just create the specific section in the upsetting.json file called connection strings, and in here I'll create the one entry called db connection string. And since we are using the PostgreSQL, the connection string will look as follows. So server will be equal to the localhost, port will be the default one, so 5432. Then we have to specify the database name, and in my case it will be the demo db for authentication. User ID in my case is the default one, so Postgres, and the password is called root. Now we will set up Entity Framework Core and the identity in the program CS file in the API location. So the first thing to do is, of course, to install a couple of the Nugget packages, and it will be only 2 of them. So the first one will be the Nugget related with the PostgreSQL database and Entity Framework Core. So I'll install this one over there. And the last one related to the Entity Framework Core will be called Entity Framework Core.design. And now I will set up the DB context. So I have to type builder.services.add DB context, and we have to pass the application DB DB context that we have created recently. And we have to, of course, reference the project of infrastructure. Inside of it, we have to use the options and to specify use PostgreSQL database. And as the parameter, it will be, of course, this created by us recently connection string in the upsetting the JSON file. So I will use builder.configuration get connection string. And our connection string was called DB connection string. And above it, we have to set up the identity. So we'll use the builder.services.add identity with the type of the user as the first one, and then identity role with the type of GUID. And inside of it, we'll use the options as well. And the first one will be the options related to the password. So options.password.require digit will, of course, require at least one digit. Options password require lowercase, of course, true. Options password require non-alpha numeric, true as well. Options password require uppercase, yes. And we can specify also the required length. So for us, it will be 8 of the characters. And at the end, it will be also the setting related to the user and the email that will be unique. And at the end, we have to specify add entity framework stores, and we have to pass the application DB context. And now, since we have everything set up related to the entity framework core and the identity, we can create our first migration to set up the database schema and then apply it against the empty database in the PostgreSQL engine. So I will just type the first command that will create for us the migration. So .NET ef migrations add. We have to be on the top of our directory, so don't be anywhere except for this main root directory. So in my case, it will be the authentication. So I am not in the API or application or anywhere else. And then I will just type init, and with the S flag, we have to specify where our API is located. So it will be authentication.api, and with the P flag will be the place where our DB context is located. So it will be authentication.infrastructure. So as you see, guys, the new migration has been created for us, and it creates the couple of database tables that are related to the identity and also our customly created columns for the ASP.NET users table. So we have the ASP.NET roles, we have the ASP.NET users, so the biggest one, and as you see, we have the first name, last name, refresh token, and refresh token expires at UTC. So it was added by us over there. We have also the role claims, user claims, of course, the user logins database table, user roles, tokens, and couple of the indexes. And now, once we have this migration and also the application DB context model snapshot, we can apply this migration to our PostgreSQL database. So we'll just type .NET EF database update. We have to specify once again with the S flag where our API is located, authentication.api, and with the P flag, it will be authentication.infrastructure. We see in the console that our command created for us the brand new database with the tables that were specified in the migration that we have created. So now we have to go back to the program CS file and start to add the logic related with the authentication and the authorization using the JWT token and also the refresh token. At the very beginning of this course, we are discussing the structure of the JSON web token, how it looks like and what it consists of. So now in order to generate one, we need a couple of the configuration values to be able to generate the JSON web token and then to properly interpret if it's valid or not. So in the upsetting JSON file, I'll create the section called JWT options. And in here, the first value will be called secret. And the secret has to be kept not in the hard-coded way like this, but I will be doing this secret hard coding only for the simplicity of this tutorial. It should be kept, for instance, in the Azure Key Vault. But now I will just paste that kind of the secret over there. So it's used to sign the JWT. So it's crucial to ensure the integrity and the authenticity of the token. The next one will be the issuer. And the issuer, in my case, will be called as is. So the issuer, it will be used as the claim. So it identifies the principal that issued the JWT token. So in this case, it's set to this value. So it's indicating that your API is the one issuing these tokens. The next one will be the audience. So in this case, it will be the, for instance, my application.mycompany.com. So the audience, in fact, it will be also treated as the claim. So it identifies the recipients that the JWT is intended for. And the last value that we'll be using is the expiration time of the token, and we'll be using the value in minutes. So expiration time in minutes, and we'll treat our JSON web token that will be valid only for the 15 minutes. In this tutorial, we'll be using the options pattern in .NET, so we'll fetch only the specific section of the app settings JSON file, and it will be stored inside of the JWT options class. So in the infrastructure layer, we'll have the directory called processors, and we'll have the authentication token processor.cs, and here we'll generate the JSON web tokens. So that means that we have to create this JWT options inside of this layer. So I'll create a directory called options, and I'll create as well the JWT options.cs class. Now we have to create public const string JWT options key JWT options. So this key will be used in the program CS file to properly fetch the settings, and it has to be the same as this one. And now we need to create 4 of the properties inside of this JWT options class for the secret, issuer, audience, and the expiration time in minutes. So going back to the file, we'll have that kind of the properties. So 3 of the type string and the one as the integer for the expiration time in minutes. So the names of those properties have to be the same as it was displayed over there. And now we have to configure these options to be able to use them later on in our infrastructure layer. So we have to load the values to this JWT options class. So I will use builder.services.configure method with the specific type JWT options. And inside of it, we'll use the builder.configuration get section, and it will be the JWT options key. Now we can implement the core functionality, so the class that will be responsible for generation of JSON web tokens and also the refresh tokens. So now I'll create the constructor and I'll inject as a parameter options interface, and I will use the JWT options that we have created recently. And I'll assign the private read-only field of the type JWT options. And I'll assign this based on this JWT options dot value. In this case, we'll be able to access all of those 4 properties. Before going forward, I need to install 3 of the Nugget packages that will be helpful for me to generate the JSON web tokens and also to access the cookies from the HTTP context. So the first one will be called Microsoft Identity Model.tokens. So I have to install this one over there. The next one will be called system.identitymodel.tokens.jwt. And Nugget package related to accessing the HTTP context will be called Microsoft ASP.NET Core HTTP.abstractions. I will create now the method to generate the JSON web token as the return type. I will have the JWT token and also the date time value of the expiration time of this token. Expires at UTC, generate JWT token, and as the parameter to this method, it will be the user entity. The most important part will be the signing key. So it will be the equal to the new symmetric security key, and as the parameter, it will be the encoded value of the secret that we are fetching from the JWT options. So encoding.utf8.get bytes based on this JWT options.secret. Then we need to assign the credentials. It will be equal to the new signing credentials. So we are passing the signing key and also the security algorithms, and we'll pick this one. Now I'll create the array of the claims based on our user that we passed as the parameter. So we need to create var claims array of the values, and inside of it we'll have new claim. And in those claims, the first one will be the type of the subject. So it will be the JWT register claim names of the type subject. And I will pass just the user.id.toString value. The next one will be the unique identifier of each token, and we would like to just generate the new ID for it. So it will be the GUID.newGUID.toString method. The next one will be the new claim of the type email that we would like to use. So it will be the email, and we'll fetch this from the user. So user.email. And the last claim that we'll use will be the claim types dot name identifier, and we'll take our user and use this toString method. So we'll take the first name and the last name as this claim. Now I'll create the token itself. So var token is equal to the new JWT security token. And as the parameter, the first one will be the issuer, and the issuer will come, of course, from our JWT options. So JWT options dot issuer. The next one will be the audience, and the audience will be equal as well to the value that we have in our configuration. Claims will be equal to the claims that we have just assigned over there. Next one will be when it actually expires. But we haven't assigned it yet. So now I will just create the value for that. Date time UTC now dot add minutes, and it will come from our JWT options expiration time in minutes. So now we have this variable of the type date time, and as the last one we need the signing credentials. So it will be equal to our credentials. And now we'll have the JWT token, and it will be equal to the new JWT security token handler. We have to write the token based on the token variable that we have assigned over there. And now we have to just return JWT token and also when it will be expired. Now I'll create the method to generate the refresh token. It will be very simple. It will be only 4 lines long. So I will just type public string generate refresh token. And at first we would like to create the byte array of size 64 to store random bytes. So I will just type var random number. So it will be equal to the new byte array of the size 64. The next one will be the random number generator dot create method to get the cryptographically secure random number generator. So I will just using in this case using var rng is equal to the random number generator dot create The next one will be the line to fill this random number array with random bytes. So I will just type rng dot get bytes, and we have to pass this random number byte array. And now we have to just return the string representation of it. So we will use the convert dot to base 64 string, and we'll use this random number that we filled up over there. We have already the method to generate the JSON web token. We have the method to generate the refresh token, but how now to safely store them somewhere? So in order to do that, I will recommend to use the HTTP only cookie. That will be the safest method to store that kind of the tokens. So in this case, we have to inject the HTTP context accessor. We'll introduce the read-only field, and in this case, I will create the method that will be called public void write authentication token as HTTP only cookie. And as the parameter, the first one will be the cookie name. So it will be suitable for both of the tokens. Then the token as the string type, and the last parameter, it will be the expiration date of this cookie, and in fact the token itself. So now we have to type HTTP context accessor dot HTTP context dot response dot cookies dot append, and now we have to pass the cookie name. Then we'll pass the token itself, and as the last parameter, we'll use the new cookie options. And now we have to assign the HTTP only flag to true. Then when it will be expired, so the expiration is essential to true, will mark the cookie as essential. So it's important for the GDPR compliance. So essential as well true. Then if it will be secure, of course, we would like to assign this to true. So this cookie will be secure. So it will only be transmitted over the HTTPS. And the same site, we would like to use the same site mode strict, so it will prevent the cookie from being sent in the cross-site request, so mitigating the CSRF attacks. All right, now once we have all of those three methods already in place, we can create the separate directory called abstracts in the application layer, where we store our interface for this auth token processor class. It will be the type of the interface. So the first method will be to generate the JWT token based on the user. I will have to reference the domain layer to be able to access this user in here. The next method was to generate the refresh token. And the last one was associated with the cookies. So it will look as follows. And now once we have this auth token processor interface, we can implement auth token processor. And of course, we have to reference the application layer to be able to use it. And now in the program CS file, I will register it. So I will just use the builder.services.add scoped. So we have to register at first the interface, auth token processor, and the class that implements that interface. So auth token processor. Now I will set up the authentication based on the JSON web token in our API. So the first thing to do is just to install one Nugget package that will be called Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT Bearer. So I'll install this one over there. And now we can start by typing builder.services.add authentication, and inside of it, we will specify the options, and those options will be the default authenticate scheme. So it will be equal to the JWT bearer defaults dot authentication scheme. The next option that we have to assign, it will be the default challenge scheme. It will be equal to the JWT bearer defaults as before, and it will be the authentication scheme once again. And the last one will be the default sign-in scheme that will be equal as well to this value. Now I will use the add JWT bearer method, and we'll have as well the options. So we have to specify at first our JWT options that we are configuring over there. So in this case, I would like just to get those options. So the configuration from our app.settings.json file, it will be equal to builder.configuration.get section JWT options.options key, and we'll use the get method. So get with the specific type of the JWT options. If it will not be present, then we'll just throw new argument exception of the name JWT options. And now, once we have the value from the app.settings.json file related to the JWT options, we are able to type options.token validation parameters. So the most important part in this middleware. And we have to assign a couple of the values that will be required to validate the JSON web token. So validate issuer, it will be equal to the true. Validate audience, of course, as well. We would like to validate the audience. Validate lifetime as well, true. Validate issuer signing key will be true as well. And the valid issuer has to be the value out of our JWT options dot issuer. Valid audience will be similarly set to the JSON web token options dot audience. And the last one will be the issuer signing key that will be equal to the new symmetric security key. And we have to pass the encoding .utf-8 get bytes, and we have to pass the secret out of this JWT options. So JWT options dot secret. And now the last part of this method will be to specify where to find this JSON web token. And this is not the default value, so not inside of the header, but we are attaching it as the cookie. So we need to type options.events. It will be equal to the new JWT bearer events. And inside of it, we have the on message received. We are passing the context. And now the context.token will be equal to the context.request.cookies. And we will be taking the access token cookie, and it will be the token to validate in this case. So all of these options to validate the issuer, audience, lifetime, and so on and so forth will be done against this token that will be retrieved from the cookies. Now the last line will be to return task completed task. After authentication, there is a time to also add the authorization, but it will be only one line, add authorization. And after that, we have to set up also authentication and authorization in here. So down below, we have to type use authentication. And after authentication, it will be use authorization. Now in the application layer, I will create directory called services, and I'll create one service that will be called account service.cs, and this service will be responsible for creation of the new users, for the login functionality, and also to refresh already expired JWT token and to generate the new refresh token as well. So I'm just gonna create the constructor and what we will need. So at first, of course, authentication token processor. And for now, I see that we'll be using the user manager of the type user manager, and to introduce the read-only field in here as well. The first method that I will create will be to register the new user. So I will type public async task register async, and as the parameter we'll take register request. And now at first we need to check if this user already exists in our database or not. If he will exist, then we need to throw the exception that he already exists and it will not be processed. So var user exists is equal to the user manager, and it will be asynchronous. So I will use the await keyword for that. Find by email async register request dot email is not equal to null. If user exists, then we have to throw new, and now I will create the new directory called exceptions in the domain layer, and we'll create exception, the custom one. So user already exists exception.cs. So it will look also pass the email as the parameter and to inherit from the exception class, and it will be user with email, and the email from the parameter already exists. And now in this account service, we can use this exception. So user already exists exception, and we can pass the email. Now, once we know that this user does not exist in our database, we can create the user entity. So in this case, we would like to use the method that we have created previously. So just to create the user based on the email, first name, and the last name. So in this case, we have to provide the parameters to this method. So it will be at first email. So register request dot email, first name, and as the last param, it will be the last name. And now, as you see in the user class, we need also to have the password hash. So it will be the representation of the password that was hashed. So in this case, we can take one method from the user manager that will hash the password provided inside of this register request that will be hashed. So in this case, I will assign the user dot password hash will be equal to the user manager dot password hasher hash password. We have to provide the entity, so the user, and also the register request dot password. And now we can create the user, so it will be the result equal to the user manager dot create async method. I have to await this, and we'll pass as the one parameter this user that we have created over there. So it will be saved in the database, of course, in the happy path. So we have to check if this result succeeded or not. So if not, we would like to throw some kind of the exception with the errors that occurred. So I'll just create new exception that will be called registration failed exception. As the parameter, will take enumerable of type string, error descriptions, and we have to inherit from the exception class. And as the parameter in here, we'll type registration failed with following errors. And now string dot join, and as the separator, we'll take environment dot new line, and after that we'll take error descriptions. Going back to this method, we'll throw this exception, so throw new registration failed exception, and we have to pass the result dot errors dot select, and we have to get only the description of those errors to this exception. And now there's the time to cover the login functionality, so I will type public async task login async method, and we'll take the login request that we have created as the parameter to this method. And now we have to check if the user exists in the database or not. So I will type user is equal to the await user manager dot find by email async, and we'll take the login request dot email. And now if the user is equal to null, so it does not exist, or await user manager check password async, and we're passing the user and also the login request dot password. If the result from this method is false, then and only then we would like to throw new login failed exception, and we would like to pass login request dot email as the parameter. And we have to create this exception. It will be the custom one. So I'll create this over there. And we'll take the email as the parameter, inherit from the exception. And it will be the invalid email and the email that we have provided, or password. And now once we know that the user exists and also the password was correct in this login request, we can proceed further. I will create the JWT token and also the refresh token for this user. So now I will just gonna deconstruct the result from the generate JWT token method. So it will be the JWT token and also the expiration date in UTC. It will be equal to the auth token processor dot generate JWT token, and we have to pass, of course, the user as the parameter. Now it will be the refresh token value as the next line. So we're just gonna use auth token processor once again, and we'll use the generate refresh token method. In this case, we have to also get the expiration date for the refresh token, and it will be hard-coded in this case. It could be also stored in the app settings JSON file, but for the simplicity now, I'm just gonna set this as the constant value. So it will be var refresh token expiration date in UTC. So it will be equal to the datetime dot UTC now dot add days, and it will be valid for 7 days. And now we can take this user and assign those two values to this entity. So the user dot refresh token will be equal to the refresh token value, and user dot refresh token expires at UTC will be equal to the expiration date in the UTC. And now we can use the update async method from the user manager to update the user. So await user manager dot update async, and we have to pass the user to this method. And now the last two lines, so to write two cookies. So the first one for the JWT token, so it will be the auth token processor, write auth token HTTP only cookie. The first one will be the access token as the cookie name. The next one will be the JWT token, and then expiration date in UTC for the JWT token. And the last line will be to write as well the auth token as HTTP only cookie, but it will be the refresh token. Will provide the user dot refresh token and the refresh token expiration date in UTC. In this case, when the user will be logged in properly, then as the result, he will receive two cookies. So access token with the JWT token and also the refresh token that will be used in order to get the new JWT token in the next method that we'll implement just in a while. And now the last method in this account service will be to refresh the access token. So to refresh the JSON web token that was expired and to return to the user new two cookies. So the new JWT token that will not be expired and also the new refresh token that will be valid once again for the next period. So for the next 7 days in this case. So I will just type public async task refresh token async, and I will just take as the parameter the refresh token that could be null, and it will be passed from our minimal API, so from the cookie itself. So at first we have to check if this string is null or empty, refresh token. If this refresh token is actually null, then we have missing refresh token and will not be able to refresh already expired access token and also to generate the new refresh token. I will create the new exception, and the last one in this tutorial, it will be the refresh token exception.cs, and it will be just simple exception string message, and we have to pass this to the exception as the message itself. And in this case, I'm just gonna throw new refresh token exception, and the message will be the refresh token is missing. Now the next check will be to get the user based on this provided refresh token from our database. For this purpose, we have to create the repository, so the custom repository, to call the database and to check based on this refresh token if you be able to retrieve the user or not. So I will just in infrastructure layer create the new directory called repositories, and I will create the user repository. And now we will generate the constructor for this user repository and take as the parameter application DB context and introduce the private read-only field for the application DB context, and we'll have one simple method, public async task of the type user that could be null, get user by refresh token async, and as the parameter will be of course the refresh token. And now var user is equal to the await application db context dot users dot first or default async, and we'll check if this refresh token is equal to the refresh token that we have provided. And now we're just gonna return the user out of this method. Now also we need to create the interface for that. So user repository, and this interface has to be in the application layer. So it will be iUser repository as the interface, and we need to have the one method. So I'm just gonna take this signature and paste it over there. So it will be only one method, and we'll implement this interface over there. Now in the program CS file, we need to, of course, register this repository. So it will be the builder.services.add scoped iUser repository and the user repository as well. And now we are able to go back to this account service and use this get user by refresh token async method. So now it will be var user is equal to the await user repository dot get user by refresh token async, and it was the refresh token as the parameter. Of course, we need to inject this repository over there, so it will be iUser repository, and we have to introduce private read-only field for that. And now, if the user is equal to null, then we'll throw new refresh token exception, and it will be unable to retrieve user for refresh token, and will not provide actually anything. So unable to retrieve user for refresh token. So now we have to check if the user, if it was valid. So we have the already user fetched by the refresh token, but we have to check if it's valid or not. So if user refresh token expires at UTC and date time UTC now as the comparison. So if it was not actually valid in this certain amount of time, we have to return also the exception because it was not valid, it was already expired, so user has to log in once again, so he's not able to refresh already expired JWT token based on this refresh token because it's also not valid, so he has to go into the login async method and once again get the JWT token and the refresh token with the expiration time of 7 days. So in this case, we'll throw new refresh token exception, the last one. Refresh token is expired. And now once we know that we have the refresh token, we have the user based on this token and it's not expired, we can take the code that we have written recently. So this code to generate the new JSON web token, to generate the refresh token and to assign to the user and to update him and to return new 2 cookies, and we'll paste it in here. In that case, based on the refresh token, we'll be able to get the new refresh token with the new expiration date for the user, and then also the access token will be returned as the not expired one. Now once we have all the functionalities in this account service, we can create the interface and register after that this account service with its abstraction. So it will be account service, and we'll create this interface in the application layer. So it will be the type of the interface, and we need to get all of those 3 methods. So the first one will be to register the user based on the register request. The next one will be the login async method. And the last one was to refresh expired JSON web token and to generate the new refresh token. And now we can go back to the program CS file and we can register account service. So it will be add scoped account service and also the account service that implements account service. And the last piece will be to create the global exception handler that will handle those exceptions, so customly created by us, and then based on the exception type, it will return proper status code and log by the logger what actually happened. So in the API, I will create the directory called handlers, and it will be the global exception handler.cs, and we have to inherit from the exception handler. We'll implement the missing members, but at first we'll create the constructor and we'll take the logger of the type global exception handler, and we'll introduce the private read-only field for that. And now I will create the helper method to get the exception details based on the provided exception. So it will be the private, and as the return type will be the HTTP status code, and also the string message, and it will be called get exception details based on the provided exception. And now we'll use the modern switch statement to get the status code and also the message. So we'll type return exception switch, and inside of it, the first exception was the login failed exception. So in this case, we'll return HTTP status code dot unauthorized, and we'll pass, of course, the exception dot message. If it was a user already exists exception, then it will be the conflict. So we'll return this HTTP status code. If it was the registration failed exception, then it will be the bad request. And the last one that we have created was the refresh token exception, and it will be as well unauthorized. And as the default one, it will be, of course, the HTTP status code dot internal server error, and it will be an unexpected error occurred, and it will be the exception dot message. And now we can get those exception details, then log as a log error, and then to return the response out of that. So now it will be status code, and also the message will be equal to the get exception details based on this exception. Now we'll use the logger, so logger.log error, and we'll pass the exception and also the exception.message. And now we'll take the HTTP context.response to assign the status code. So it will be status code equal to the integer status code. Now we have to write the response as the JSON. So it will be the HTTP context dot response dot write as JSON async. So it will be the message and also the cancellation token. And I see that we haven't assigned this method as the async. So of course we need to do that. And as the last line will be just to return that it was handled. So return true. Now we have to register this exception handler. So in the program CS file, I will add the line for the builder.services.add exception handler, and the type will be our created previously global exception handler. And now above the HTTPS redirection, I will just assign the use exception handler, and in this case we have to register this exception handler like that in order to make it work properly. And now we can finally start to define the endpoints for our API. So the first one will be the register endpoint. So I will type app map post API / account / register, and as the parameters it will have register request from our domain layer, and also account service And inside of it, we'll invoke one method from our account service, and it will be the register async method. So account service dot register async method, and we are passing the register request to it, and we'll return results dot OK. And in case of any exception, it will be handled by our exception handler. The next endpoint will be the login endpoint, and it will look very similar to it, but it will invoke another method. So it will be login request from our domain layer, login request, and we'll use the login async method for that. The next endpoint will be called refresh endpoint. So we'll modify this login endpoint to use not the login request, but HTTP context itself, because we need to fetch the refresh token out of the request cookie. So it will use the refresh token async, and of course we need to pass the refresh token. So it will be fetched in this way. Refresh token is equal to the HTTP context dot request dot cookies, and we need to get a refresh underscore token cookie. And once we have this value, we can pass to our method. And the last one will be the endpoint to retrieve the list of the movies that it will require the authorization. So in this case, this endpoint will be secured, and only the user that was authenticated will be able to use this endpoint. So map get API movies, and it will return the results.ok, and inside of it we'll have the new list of type string, and it will be only matrix, and at the end we need to decorate this endpoint with the require authorization. And now, in order to be able to use the HTTP context itself, we need to add one more line in the program CS file, and it will be the builder.services.add HTTP context accessor. And now, since we are not able to use the Swagger anymore in the .NET 9 web APIs, we can use the Scalar, so it will serve the same functionality as the Swagger. So now we have to install scalar.asp.NET Core NuGet package. So I will do this. And in here, we can just type up map Scalar API reference with some only simple options to have the title, and the title will be JWT plus refresh token auth API. Alright guys, now we are ready to test our whole solution. So we have to run this API and use the Scalar with the slash to be able to access this UI. And now we'll start with this first protected endpoint to get the list of the movies. So when I will send this now, and I have no cookies associated with JSON Web Token, of course, I'm getting 401 unauthorized response. And now let's first create the new user. So it will be first name, last name, email will be, let's say, this kind of email, email.com, and the password will be some randomly created password. And now when I will send, we see that we are getting inside of this register endpoint. And now we are finding the user based on the email. it does not exist, we can create the new user, and of course, everything succeeded, and as the result, we are getting 200 OK response. And now, and I'll copy this email and the password, and we'll go to the login endpoint. I'll paste this over there, and when I'll click on the send to send this request, we are going inside of this login endpoint. And now we are checking if this user already exists in our database. If yes, then we have to check the password, if it's valid or not. If everything went fine, we are able to generate, of course, the JWT token, the expiration time for this token in UTC, and also the refresh token that will be just now assigned to this user. The user will be updated and will write those two values, so the access token and the refresh token, as the HTTP only cookies. And now, once we see in the storage itself, we see that we have access token and the refresh token in our browser. So now, when I will be able to send the request once again, I'm getting 200 OK response. So it means that we were properly authorized in terms of getting the result out of this API/movies endpoint. And now the last functionality to test will be the refresh endpoint. So when I will click send, now as you see, we are inside of this refresh endpoint, and we are taking the value out of the cookie, so this refresh token. And now we are checking if it's null or empty. If we are able to get the user based on this refresh token, of course, we have the recently created user. Once we have this user already in place, we can check if this token is expired or not. If it's not, then we are going further and we are creating the new JSON web token, new refresh token. We're assigning everything to this user and writing the new access token and new refresh token. As you see, we have 200 OK response and the brandly new created access token and refresh token as well. And now we'll test not only the happy path, but also when something will go wrong in this API. So the first and the very easy thing to test will be to send the register request with the same data. So it means that this user already exists in the database and we should get some kind of the exception. So when I click send, register async method, if the user already exists, yeah, true, and we are throwing user already exists exception. Then it goes inside of this global exception handler, and based on that, it checks that this is this kind of the exception and we have the conflict. So then it returns 409 conflict as the response. So now when I will check also this login endpoint and I will provide something that will be not the valid password, then as we see, the user exists, but actually it has not the valid password. So we are throwing the login failed exception. Then also it goes inside of this global exception handler and we're getting 401 unauthorized response. And inside of the network, we are getting the response payload, so the invalid email or password. Previously, it was the payload that the user with email already exists. And now the last thing that we would like to test to only check if also the refresh token endpoint is properly protected will be to go inside of the storage and would like to add something to this refresh token to make it that it will be invalid. So when I have added something to it, then it's receiving the value out of that, and it's not null or empty. And we are trying to get the user based on the refresh token async. And of course, it's null because in the user entity itself in the database, this token is not associated with any user. So in this case, we are throwing this refresh token exception. And in this case, that this token will be already expired, then of course, the same exception will be thrown with some other info inside of it. So when I'll click on the resume program, then we are getting 401 unauthorized, and in the network tab, we see that it was unable to retrieve user for refresh token. Alright guys, so that's everything for this course. I hope that it was helpful for you. If yes, then make sure to smash the subscribe button down below, to give me the like, to write the comment, and also consider to support me on the Patreon. The link is down below in the description. See you in the next one.